have a sewing area full of tools that I love to use on a regular basis, but at a glance, some of them don't look like they have anything to do with sewing. So today, I'm sharing my 6 favorite unexpected sewing tools that technically don't have anything to do with sewing. These are in no particular order except this one, because these are one of my most used sewing tools. These are flat washers from the hardware store, and I use them as my pattern weights. If you've ever considered changing from cutting out your sewing patterns with pins and scissors to using a rotary cutter, this is not a color, a rotary cutter and pattern weights, you can't get any cheaper than washers from the hardware store for pattern weights. I am on team rotary cutter and pattern weights all the way. I don't actually know if that's because my mom originally taught me that way, although I'm sure she will let me know in the comments, or if I just decided pinning and scissors was for the birds and I'm doing it this way. Because I've made many sewing decisions that way. I don't like this, I'm going to find a different way to do it. But these types of washers come in a few different sizes, and they certainly don't take up very much room to store, unlike some of the commercially available pattern weights. You've probably seen me use these in about 80% of my videos. I just walked up to the bins at the hardware store and looked at the different sizes and thought, I like that one, and grabbed a handful of each. Sadly for you though, if you want to know where I got this lovely little stand, and I've been asked this a few times, the answer is, I asked my dad to make it for me. So it has a little dowel for each of the sizes, each different size dowel, so I know which one is which, and it just stacks on there, and it's perfect. I even think I told him I was going to paint it red, and when he sent it to me, it was already painted red. But speaking of painting, I've seen people paint these either with like acrylic paint or nail polish. You could even cover them in fabric. I've seen that as well. But honestly, for me, they've just been just fine as they are plain. Next up, we have, this is just a calculator. But hear me out. We all use our phones for everything these days, and sometimes it's nice to just have an excuse to not use your phone. Enter the humble calculator. I don't know about you, but I do a lot of small math in my sewing area. Calculating yardage, like I have 52 inches of fabric left. How many yards does that work out to so I can see if it will fit for my pattern piece? Or adding seam allowances to things. And if that happens to you too, and you don't want to have to rely on your phone, just get a simple calculator for your sewing room. And if you happen to be used to using your phone to help calculate sewing fractions, just keep a little note with it next to your calculator. Like 5/8 of an inch is 0.625, half an inch is 0.5, 3/8 of an inch is 0.375. Can you tell I do this a lot? I used to use the same ugly calculator that I've had wow, that is dusty. Oh boy, okay. Since probably high school, and then when I redid my sewing area a few years ago, I got a nice cute little pink one to match my area. I keep it in one place, that spot right over there. I always know where it is, and I don't need to pull out my phone and get sucked into all that when I just need to do a little sewing math. This is another of my unexpected sewing tools that I love. It's a random vintage double-pointed knitting needle. I have no idea where the other ones are or where it came from, and you may be thinking, wrong craft here, right? Nope, this is really helpful for a couple of things when sewing. I love to use a knitting needle to gently poke out the corners of things like collars when sewing. And I think that's a somewhat common use for people who both sew and knit. But what I really like the knitting needle for is when I have a tube and I've turned the tube, like a little skinny little tube like this, and one end is closed and it's all kind of lumpy, and I want to poke that end like I would poke a collar, but you think, how am I going to get something down there? A knitting needle is perfect because you can just slide it down the tube, kind of drop it down to the end of the tube, use it to poke the little end carefully, and then just slide it back out. You can't fit much down these narrow little tubes, but you can fit a knitting needle, particularly a double-pointed knitting needle, since there's nothing on either end to get in your way. Just slide it down a little tube and you can poke out the ends super easy. No knowledge of knitting required. Next up for unexpected sewing tools I love is a glue stick. And there's a couple of reasons that I like to keep glue sticks in my sewing area. The first is because I keep a sewing notebook to document my projects. And you can watch my sewing journal video to learn more about that. I'll link it in the description. I like to cut a little square of fabric out and glue it into my sewing journal with a little description about the fabric so I remember what I used. So that's technically more of a sewing adjacent reason for having a glue stick. But they can also be used for actual sewing too. You can use them to baste zippers in place along your seam allowance, or baste belt loops on pants before you sew them. That's one of the things I really love to do. They're also really great for basting trim on, like rickrack. And I did that for this top, which is very wrinkly. But I did this for this top so that I didn't have to try and pin all this and I could get perfectly straight lines by just glue basting those rickracks onto the shirt first. They make fabric glue sticks specifically for that purpose, and I have one here. Okay, I had one here. I can't even get the top off. Okay. Ha! I made the garbage. But I tend to use all-purpose glue sticks, and they're cheaper anyway. The first time I was sewing and I said to myself, you know what I need right now? Tweezers. And I had to go upstairs to get a pair, is when I started keeping some tweezers in my sewing area and why they're one of my favorite unexpected sewing tools. I have a few different types. I have these really long ones that are handy for getting into my serger when I'm threading it. And I also have a couple pairs of just kind of normal ones. One that's a little bit more dull at the tip and one's a little bit pointier. Both are useful for different things. Particularly since I wear my nails a little long, sometimes tweezers can be really helpful to get into tiny little areas that you couldn't normally access. Things that are just smaller than fingers. Like I love to use them when I have a tube and I want to turn the open end back in on itself so I can sew it shut, but I'd never be able to get my fingers in there to do that. And they're just great in general for tiny little fussy areas when you're sewing. They take up no space. I like to have them in different places for different needs. And in general, your craft room is a great place to retire your tweezers when they're no longer sharp enough for their normal purposes. My last favorite unexpected sewing tool is a hole punch. This is a hole punch, and this is also a hole punch. And I use both of these all the time for sewing. Technically, I think I have something like 4 different types of hole punches in my sewing area, but my sewing area is also my general craft area, so only 2 of those actually have to do with sewing. The other 2 are for paper crafting, and technically you'd probably think that these are for paper crafting too. If you trace your sewing patterns, and if not, you should watch my video on my top 5 reasons to trace sewing patterns. I'll link it in the description. When you want to mark things on your pattern piece, like the apex of a bust dart, or pleats, or the stopping or starting line for stitching, there's no better way to do that than using a hole punch to punch out those marks on your pattern piece, like these holes here for this bust dart. And here's a fun little sewing history trivia about this. Early commercial sewing patterns were cut and punched, where all of those markings were punched out of the tissue like this. Printed sewing patterns didn't start until McCall's in the early 1920s, when all the markings then started to be actually printed on the tissue itself and no longer cut out of it. But there were also some brands that did a hybrid of both for a while before printed patterns truly took over. In fact, the brand Pictorial Review argued that their patterns, which were a hybrid of both, so they had punched-out perforations along with printing, meant that they were better than only printed patterns, because with those perforations, you could more easily chalk through the markings to your fabric. And that is the exact reason that I love the hole punch. Punching out those markings makes it so easy to transfer that to your fabric. But you can't just use one of those squeeze type hole punchers because you have to get out into the center of the paper sometimes and not just along the edge. So one of the types I like to use is called a screw punch, where you literally just push down the surface and it creates a hole. I'll link this one in the description. Or you can also use this type, which comes with little interchangeable tips for different size holes. I got this from a scrapbooking kit, and you use a little hammer and you just hammer your hole just like that. That was 100% the carpenter's daughter in me, because I could totally have hit it like this, but instead I turned it around to use the correct side. I also like to put a little piece of tape over the holes before I punch them out, because it helps reinforce the paper over time, which is particularly helpful if you use a little chalk wheel, because those teeny little teeth tend to chew up the paper a little bit each time you use it. I also recommend, since those hole punches do tend to leave a mark on whatever surface is underneath what you're punching out, that you have a surface that you like to dedicate just to that. Like I have this very ancient cutting mat that I use specifically for this purpose. It's covered in hundreds of tiny little round circular indentations from using my hole punches over the years. And hole punches are really helpful for other sewing reasons, not just for pattern tissue. They're great if you're going to sew eyelets by hand as a little decorative element, or if you're going to use a grommet setter to make something like a belt and you want to cut out the hole in your fabric and your belting. A hole punch is a super handy thing to have in your sewing area. So you tell me, what surprising tools do you have in your sewing area that you can't live without? Tell me in the comments. In the meantime, check out one of these two videos. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you again soon with more vintage sewing.